What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Blazed and Confused, the podcast where curiosity is high, confidence is questionable, and logic usually shows up late. As always, I'm your host, Max, and this week I'm coming to you solo. Like I said last week, Noah is getting ready to have that baby showing up anytime, so he's taking a little bit of leave of absence for that. So, first week by myself. I've got something I kind of stumbled across that I think is something kind of interesting. I didn't know the actual full story behind this, and then come to find out there's a conspiracy surrounding it. But the New York subway has a pretty crazy history, also followed by a conspiracy because, um, it's just odd. So, I mainly did this because when you think New York subway, you're probably thinking it's like, 50s, 60s, sometime around when they get around uh, away from steam engine trains and stuff. Well, boy, I would hate to tell you, but we are wrong. These these tunnels have been around for decades before it became a railroad. Um, Even better, now known as the subway. In 1844, roughly, is when these tunnels kind of show up, right? So this one's before we get to the subway. I just include this because I think it's a little interesting. Um, the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel is you know, our starting point. It's constructed in 1844, and it's for the Brooklyn and Jamaica Railroad. Uh, it wasn't a subway, the way that we know it, but it was an underground railroad tunnel that went underneath Cobble Hill. So, get your map out, kind of look at where this is going. But 1844 is when we build our first railroad tunnel. It's not a subway yet, but it's a railroad tunnel. Now, this is mainly just to get rid of a dangerous mountainscape, hill, whatever you want to call it. And this allowed trains to go without disrupting street and everything else. So obviously, this after a while gets closed down, and people just forget about it. Um, Crazier part is it's not rediscovered for over 100 years. In 1980s is when we find it. So, you know, who's building these tunnels back in 1844 that's big enough for a train to go through? I mean, yeah, I get it. We've got mining and whatever else, but this isn't like minecart tunnels. This is railroad tunnels. Um, Pretty crazy, right? So don't just keep that in your head. 1844 is where it first starts, right? Then we're gonna jump up to 1867. Now this is when Alfred Eli Beach, who happens to be an inventor and publisher of Scientific American, um, he he gets pretty interested with pneumatic transportation. Now, what that just means is he's using air pressure to move vehicles through tubes. So, like, your bank, when you go, I'm probably dating myself a little here, but if you go to the bank and you put something in that little capsule they shoot out to you when you're in a drive-through bank, um, that's pretty much what he's doing, but with vehicles. So in 1867, he demonstrates a small pneumatic railway, which, again, this is 1860 something. Crazy to think that this is going on in that day and age. But he even takes it one step further. He's like, we've got a pneumatic railway. Let's let's go underground with this. It's probably an eyesore looking at a tunnel that's shooting um, capsules of whatever. So in 1868, 1869, roughly, he begins secretly building this pneumatic tube project that's, you know, all to be built underground. Well, he, of course, like all secrets, builds it underneath Broadway. and somehow managed to keep it a secret. Now, this tunnel he makes is approximately 312 feet long with about an 8 feet diameter. So it's nothing small. Now, this is running from Warren Street all the way towards Broadway. Again, look at your map so that you can see kind of the area. And he did all of this as as you would when you're trying to keep it a secret. He does it all at night, and does it underground. So crazy. Um, Now this is it's just wild. Now we've got a tunnel in 1844 for a railway. We've got a dude building air powered travel that's underground being constructed in secret. Now, why is he doing it secretly? Well, because he wanted to do this basically as a surprise. He opens it in 1870 to the public. Now, people can enter underground, and then they ride a small car through the tunnel. Um, Hundreds of thousands of people experience this attraction while it's open. And this is where, again, it's kind of crazy. In 1870, we now technically have the first variation of a subway. Also in New York City area, New York, in a populated area. Um, and this is before the subway that we know is created. Now, here's where it gets a little weird. He wants to expand this, obviously. You get something this popular, what do you want to do? Make more of it. More money, more more opportunity for growth. So, at this point, he's got this idea to let's make it bigger. But then he starts getting into political problems, financial issues. He runs into some obvious legal restrictions, and then competition from the elevated railways that's working against him. So, as you would assume, this project dies off. Um, and, for safety or secrecy or what have you, this tunnel gets sealed off and forgotten about. And then this tunnel in 1912 comes back. Now, this is why it gets crazy. While people are getting ready to construct the subway that we know for Broadway, they encounter this beach tunnel that had been forgotten. Now, mind you, this runs like 1870, runs for a little while, and then just disappears and doesn't get touched till 1912. So could you imagine, like, you're digging for a railway tunnel and you stumble across another tunnel that's got essentially airtight. So it's crazy. Um, but this isn't just an empty place. No, they find evidence of the old construction, and that includes the original tunnel infrastructure and the famous tunneling shield. Now, um, if you're confused as to what that is, again, while you've got your map up, look up the tunneling shield for the subway. Pretty crazy that this was built, back in 1800s. But because it was somewhat airtight, they say that it was kept in actually surprisingly good condition. Now, this is kind of where it's like, wow, all of this has stood the tale of time. It's old school. It's something that hadn't been seen in decades. And now, while you're building something that's supposed to be new aged and even a crazy idea for the time, this happens. So, you know, this is when they're digging for Broadway's subway. The original movement for the subway um, kind of happened just slightly before that in 1900. It starts, but in 1865, 1890, the New York transit problem becomes an issue, right? The population's exploding, horse cars are slow, the streets are becoming really congested, and these elevated railways are nice, but they don't take care of everything. So now these underground transits, and people are liking it. They're like, "Whoa, this is we like this." So after decades of arguing to try and get this to be a thing through politics, finances, proposals, everything, 1894, they finally established the legal and political framework that's necessary for them to do this. So now, like I said, in 1900, John B. McDonald wins the construction contract, and August Belmont backs the project. So the official groundbreaking date is in March of, again, the 1900. So now this starts the actual construction. Now, mind you, again, we're still in 1900. I don't know about you listeners, but when I heard that, I said there's absolutely no way. We built a subway in the 1900s, like the beginning of 1900 date, 1900. Now I thought that was nuts. So, of course, after I hear about that, I start to look at, well, how'd they do this? This is pretty far back in the past. So how did they? So, they did a technique called cut and cover. So this is you rip open the street, you excavate a giant trench, you support the surrounding buildings and utilities, you build the subway structure, you cover it back up, and then you rebuild the street. Sounds rather complicated, right? Well, the original 1904 subway documentation describes roughly excavating 30 feet below the street and then constructing the subway within that. So they're digging down 30 feet. Now, again, this is in the like very, very early days. So they don't have a giant machine like we do. I mean, I'm sure there's still a machine, but it's not near as effective, not near as fast, can't go as far. Um, so crazy. Now, some of, or well, sorry, most of these tunnels um, were done doing this. Now, this is through a lot of like the modern MTA documents that support this. So here's where again, I kind of mentioned they're trying to do this like before you would believe it's feasible. So obviously they're not able to cut everything, right? Um, so under some of these deeper areas like rivers, buildings, difficult areas to dig, whether it be rock, mountain, whatever, they had to use different tunneling techniques. So this is where they start using tunneling shields, compressed air, pneumatics, drilling, blasting, excavating by hand, building temporary supports, building cast iron tunnel segments, and using concrete and brick and everything of that sort. So all the workers are actually underground while they're building all this. So this is where it's crazy. In the 1904 construction record, it describes some subcontractors working block by block with drills, picks, and shovels. So literally, dudes just down there mining a literal tunnel to build what we now know as a subway. So in 1904, more exactly October 27th of 1904, the official New York City subway opens. Now you heard me correct. That is 1904. Nearly 122 years ago, we developed this. Now, that to me alone is astounding that for 122 years, one, that this has still been the same concept. Obviously, there's been renovations and changes, but for that long, we have not found a better way to move people underground or whatever. I mean, obviously, yeah, there's planes, helicopters, faster subways, cars, but it is astounding to me that for this long, that's been a method of travel that is benefited the city in a way that obviously it still stands. So crazy to me. So the initial system runs from City Hall all the way to 145th Street and then Broadway. Um, it was approximately only 8.5 miles long. Um, but, for them to be doing it the way they did, that's awesome. The opening is huge. Roughly 150,000 people ride the system on the opening day. Now, that's by actual reporting that was done. So the City Hall station is designed kind of as like their showpiece. It's got vaulted ceilings, decorative tile, glazed terracotta, architectural ornamentation, so just plants. The subway, it wasn't just transportation. It was, like I've said a couple of other times, it's a flex. They wanted to show that they could do it. And what better way to show that New York's entered the modern age than just building an underground subway? So this is where it gets crazy, this boom, right? Now that it's already been established and it's a thing, uh, let's grow it. Let's improve on this. Um, so they did what every good idea does, and they start to expand. So in 1904, roughly to 1910, it expands through Manhattan into the Bronx, into Brooklyn, um, and that's where they start. 1913, now there's dual contracts. So now we're building more at the same time. And this creates a lot of the foundation that is still used to this day of how this network was going to spread and branch and where it was going to service and everything else. So now, not only has the subway been around for 120 something years, but now this network that we've just barely improved on has been around for, 110 years. And by the 1920s, this is an essential part of New York transportation. No surprise. You're not walking on the street. You're not riding behind a horse. You're not, doing all of the big things that people had an issue with. New York has been a huge populace because of its location. And then, of course, it's become an essential part of their transportation. And even more importantly, it's proving that it works. This isn't like, unfortunately, the World Fair is a little bit different. That is just a showcase for things that are kind of coming out that year. This is a permanent fixture that is, it works. We're going to keep using it, and we did it. Nobody else has this yet. So now in 1932, there's an independent subway system that begins operating. And then that only lasts for about 8 years. And then they consolidate the IRT, BMT, and the IND systems. Now, this is all that network that we're talking about. If you, again, want to kind of look at that, look at the 1940 New York subway map. It is astounding to how big it is. And then it took until 1940 for it to be consolidated. Now at this point they're all incorporated with each other. So we've completely maximized the usage of the subway at this point. But now here's where things get a little bit scarier. You would think, oh, when they expand, they're just improving on where they're at. No, no. That leaves the mysterious side. Some even say the forgotten side of the subway. Um, it's not just the functioning subway. This has been tunnel systems for, at this point, over 100 years, even at this point. Now, still, there are abandoned stations, platforms that just get shut down when improvements get made or changes get made, stations that they just said, no, never mind, it's not feasible, or we've picked a better one. So half built, essentially. Tunnels that are still to this day abandoned. That to me is what kind of piqued my interest from the get go. It's one of the conspiracies I've seen all of these really tie into it. Um, you know, utility tunnels that exist down there, just kind of creepy. Give you a back rooms vibe, kind of that, you know, just uneasy feeling when you see them. Pedestrian tunnels, I don't believe these get used as much. There's still some to and from. Same thing like up in L. There's pedestrian tunnels, or not up in L. Up in Chicago, there's pedestrian tunnels nowadays, but these ones, have existed for however long. And Chicago has the elevated track more so than they do subway. Um, Old streetcar infrastructure still kind of remains. So, like old substations and stuff like that that aren't necessarily used. Creepier part is like sealed entrances and then forgotten stuff that now sits beneath the modern stuff. Um, whether it be tunnels, um, decorations, whatever it may be. Um, and a lot of these are like actual historical things that still exist. Now, to me, that was almost more unsettling. We have all this history that's still down there that's buried and probably will never come back out. So, little odd that we've got all that history and we just leave it buried. Um, so now again, City Hall Station, um, being a big grand thing like it was, um, eventually it closes. Now this is in 1945, and it's because it had a curved platform that was designed for the older cars. The older cars, I believe, only sat about four people in them. Um, Obviously, improvements kept getting made. Since that, the newer cars can't make the turn as safe. Now, again, the creepy part of this is it still sits underneath City Hall. So there's this big grand thing that they built that sits beneath City Hall. You do yourself a favor and avoid looking it up unless you want to get a little bit of the heebie-jeebies, um, because it is very dystopian. It is it's very neat, but before it got renovated and cleaned up and everything else, it it was this very elegant place built to be kind of like we said the showpiece, and it didn't deteriorate much, but there were portions of it that did, and boy, it's amazing architecture and design. But could you imagine finding this after it had been condemned and abandoned, and who knows what happened, during the time of it being sealed off? Now it's been reopened, renovated, so that people can go and see what had eventually shut down. But um, it's crazy. And just to make you think, like, how many of these places still exist and they're right beneath your feet? It's just like the ocean, man. Noah and I have said from the get go, the ocean is scary only because you don't know what's beneath you. Now, I'm bringing this part in. What what's beneath you in New York? You never know. There's so many tunnels and stuff that are lost, and that unless you have like ground penetrating sonar or something of that sort, you will never truly know. Um, so now to bring it out of the scary abandoned portions of it, there's also ghost stories and everything else that come from the subway older portions and abandoned tunnels, which I feel like is kind of a theme, just like with the catacombs in Paris. You've got this underground thing that there's no light, no nothing, whatever. So um, now to bring it back from being just dark, I'm gonna bring in a conspiracy. Quite a few of them actually. So one of the largest conspiracies that's circulating is people are saying that the subway is actually older than we think. You got these tunnels from the mid 1800s that we found abandoned in the 1900s. And, who's to say there's nothing that's even older than that? And that's what drew me to this to begin with. Because if we have these tunnels, it's one of those that it's like a why. Why did they exist before? Obviously the one is to get through a mountain range or, what have you. But why did we have these other ones? And why did they get sealed off? Did we see something we weren't supposed to, or did something see us? That's what a lot of people are throwing that theory out for. Just to bring it back a little bit, the beach tunnel. This is the second theory that has kind of spread around. Um, so his project was actually the one that, just bringing it back for you, is the beach tunnel was done for the pneumatic railway, like we'd said earlier. But people are saying that the tunnel was larger than it needed to be, right? And it was built underneath one of the most important streets, and then just got abandoned. And then decades later, we find it. So this is why a lot of conspiracists are saying, was this just experimenting with pneumatic transit, or was he trying to build something, more than what it was? Um, Problem with this is there's nothing to prove that. So it's just speculation, as almost all conspiracies turn out to be. But, it does make you wonder, why do you build it so big if it wasn't needed? So, you know, leaves all these unanswered questions that keep you awake at night. You know, you've got all these underground tunnels that got built hundreds of years ago, and they're still standing, still being used, and that's it's crazy. But the third theory is that there's more tunnels than we know about, which is not very hard for me to believe, because if you want to keep something a secret, keep it underground. Limit the access of who can get there. It's going to keep things a mystery. You know, there's there's so many undiscovered things that we just keep coming across that really helps this theory stay alive. It's There's a lot of spaces that have been discovered that aren't part of a subway system, that have no explanation other than later being told, oh, it's an access tunnel, or it's for maintenance, or whatever it may be. But it is there's so many things that are undiscovered, and it kind of also lets you believe, like most of these theorists do, what if it's part of that giant mud flood that happened, well, allegedly happened, the one that they say buried like Tartaria or Tartaria, however you want to pronounce it. Um, if you haven't seen anything about that, it's it's a very hard one to not believe, especially with us having already talked about Antarctica. There's there's so many old things that we've never discovered or keep rediscovering that leave these questions unanswered. We found abandoned subway stations, platforms that never got used, tunnels, sealed passageways, utilities, all these things that we've found, and it kind of just leaves you with questions. Why are they there? Why don't we use them anymore? And it keeps people questioning. So, you know, were the tunnels already there? I mean, we know that some technically were. All this stuff started in 1844, and we're to believe that we found everything that ever happened. Also, a guy built an entire underground passageway that went undiscovered. that later was announced that God only knows if we would have even heard about if he didn't have something to show us. Um, tunnels that get forgotten about, rediscovered. Um, these subway systems got built so long ago, and they're still there. They're the ones that we know. It's odd. We have all the plans, construction records, photographs of everything, newspapers on how everything was built, and it was so long ago. I mean, there may not be evidence of an ancient civilization or an ancient, you know, tunnel building system that got covered up, but who knows? It could be under the ground. Could literally be right beneath our feet. And that's the part that again keeps people up. And there's so much stuff that's been sealed in and forgotten about, and it's like I said at the beginning, it's very much like the ocean. We don't know what's down there. We can't really explore it without physically exploring it. And then at what point do we give up? It's odd. So the next time you're out walking on the sidewalk, walking in your neighborhood, doing whatever, think about what might be beneath your feet. There's so much history that's buried underneath of us that we'll probably never know the extent of. And that's kind of why this topic had caught my attention. Not only because it was so long ago, and you would think if the idea was brought up to you, you'd be like, well, why are they talking about a subway system that got built like, I don't know, 80 years ago? Nah, it's got an extensive past. And on top of that, there's so much mystery that it opens up that I felt like this was going to be a good topic. So, if this is something that interested you, let me know. Um, very, very scary to think that something might be beneath us and we don't know. As I always joke with Noah, you watch the movie Rain of Fire. Maybe now that he's having a kid, I'll buy it for him so he's got something to do during the day. But I mean, in that movie, they go mining, come across a dragon. What's to say that's not happening now? But in reality, it's really nothing, or probably nothing. And I'm just doing a little bit of fear mongering or piquing your interest. But thank you for tuning in yet again. This has been Blazed and Confused. Peace.